Okay. New documentary has hit Netflix, a film called Hating Peter Tatchell. Really interesting documentary, and it's my great pleasure to be speaking to the writer-director of the documentary, Chris Amos. Chris, welcome to Movie Metropolis.
Hi there, Peter. Thank you for having me.
Now, Chris, you've made a number of short films, and I read promotions, documentary, short docos and so on. How did it come about that you're able to make this first feature documentary?
Well, I'd produced another documentary called Dressed as a Girl for director Colin Rothbart. So I did that as a process so I could learn how to make a feature documentary and from beginning to end, and then get it to market and have it distributed. So I then always knew that I wanted to move into directing myself. And I had access to Peter, and we'd known each other for almost 2 decades. And it was a story that I just was really passionate about because of his conviction and his struggles, but also the message he was sending. And I thought it would be an inspirational film. And I also thought it was a really great way of sort of showcasing the gay liberation movement over half a century, using this one character as a catalyst through that. So that's, yeah, so it was just meant to be. Mm.
And what was is so impressive, I mean, there's a number of things I want to talk about, but getting Elton John to be a producer, and he's also in the film, and to get the production behind you to make this documentary must have been quite a task for you.
Yeah, it wasn't easy. Initially, I was living in the UK and we were attempting to get funding over there, but it just wouldn't. I couldn't get a TV commission for it, or a feature documentary fund to do it. I think they were kind of worried that it was going to turn into some sort of propaganda thing for Peter, and he had such a reputation. I think that made commissioners a little nervous. So I moved to Australia and hooked up with Veronica Fury at Wild Bear Entertainment in Queensland. And she sort of rallied behind the project. She saw what I saw. And then, yeah, the rest is history. We got Screen Australia funding and Screen Queensland funding. But then in terms of Elton and David Furnish getting involved, that was later down the track. Because I knew they were supporters of Peter. So anyone that I knew was a supporter of Peter, I did reach out to, knowing that they might get offended if we hadn't reached out to them. So I had to give them at least the opportunity to be involved. And fortunately, a lot of them said yes.
Well done on that. That's a great kudos to you. Now, Peter Tatchell is such an interesting person, and very provocative and very polarizing in his approach to human rights and gay issues, etc. How much was he willing to be involved in the documentary insofar as telling his story, warts and all, I suppose?
Yeah, well, obviously, it needed to be a collaborative process in terms of outlining what his story is, because I have to, fact check everything. Being a documentary, I couldn't make things up. So he was very, very generous. We would have catch-up meetings every couple of months, so I wouldn't just be drip feeding and hassling him all the time. But also I needed contact details for his family and friends and people he grew up with here in Australia, as well as his contacts in the UK. So I also knew that at the end of the project that I would want his endorsement, so that when it does come out, that he could benefit from the publicity and also be a spokesperson for the film. But at the same time, I had to also be objective and sort of show a side to him that he might not necessarily feel comfortable with. So that was something I addressed really early on in the process and explained to him what documentary storytelling is. It's not just about like laying out the facts. You've got to actually craft like a story in amongst all of that. And so for that to happen, there has to be turning points and beats, and there's got to be parts of the film where you're not necessarily going to be like a messiah, you're going to be hated, and hence the name Hey Peter Tatchell. So I sort of explained all of that to him, and he understood. He's smart enough to realize that that's a necessary part of filmmaking, storytelling. So yeah, but he's been really generous with his time and support for me. And I think also being a first-time director and a gay Australian living in the UK, I think he had a bit of a connection with me in terms of knowing that I wasn't there to exploit his story for commercial gain and stuff like that, because I think he's quite grassroots, and I'm quite a bohemian type grassroots type of person as well. So I think that's kind of why he was more generous with his time with me, I think. Yeah.
And also, what helps significantly, you have a number of interviews in the documentary, but Stephen Fry and Ian McKellen being on board and talking to Peter and also commenting on what he has been involved with. I mean, that was a significant advance, I suppose, in your documentary.
Yeah, more so George Carey though, because the former Archbishop George Carey was a critic, and I was more looking forward to having his involvement so that the film had a critical analysis and just wasn't all about supporters of Peter. Even amongst like Stephen Fry and Ian, you know, at the time when Peter was outing archbishops, they weren't necessarily on his side in regards to that. So there was some objectivity in amongst the interviews with Angela Mason and Tom Robinson as well about the tactics. And I think that actually was something that I wanted to explore in the film title and the story as well. And I think that sort of makes it a more well-balanced film in the end. But Stephen Fry was amazing. And he also had the input about and commentary on what's happening in Russia, because he's been over there himself and worked on some TV programming about LGBT Russia. So it was really important that I had his involvement, because I knew that that's where the film was going to end up towards the end, sort of shining a spotlight on Chechnya and what's happening in Chechnya and Russia. Yeah.
Yes, I've been hearing stories about Chechnya, and I've seen another documentary about how gay people are treated in Chechnya. It's horrendous stuff. So, yeah. So in the construction of the story, it is quite an elaborate construction. In fact, you start off with quite a brutal attack on Peter early on in the film, and some great archival footage and the interviews that I mentioned and so on. So piecing all that together to make it a coherent documentary, again, that must have been quite a process for you.
Yeah, it really was, because we're covering 7 decades of someone's life in a 90-minute film. And there's a lot of things that didn't make it into the final film just because they didn't fit into the overall jigsaw puzzle. It really was a jigsaw puzzle, because I had probably about 300 hours of archive footage that I'd just been downloading off YouTube and collecting. And then there's all of the activism and all of the protests that I filmed with Peter over 5 years, as well as what happened in Moscow. So, but ultimately, once I had all of that big play pit to play in, it really just came down to, okay, what's the essence of this guy's journey? And I looked at his story in terms of what would happen in a Marvel superhero film. So you sort of start with this origin story, and then something happens, which is a catalyst for that. And then that happens and that happens. And then it escalates and just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So I used the story beats for the Joker, as it happens, which was another sort of anti-hero sort of type character in cinema. And yeah, you know, you just map it out and you go, okay, in the first 10 minutes, this has to happen in the next 10, and so forth. And then you sort of just know what's in the play pit. How does that construct through? And initially, we were going to be doing some time jumping. So we had 2 stories going on, the observational stuff, him going off to Moscow, and then the archival biography stuff. But then when we did that first rough cut, it just was too juxtaposed to work properly, because you're already seeing him as he is as an old man early on, and so it just took away the mystery of the film's flow. So eventually we ended up just doing a linear storyline, but that opening sequence where is high impact was mainly just to get those eyeballs to keep watching. And a lot of the viewers might not necessarily have known who Peter was. So for them to buy into a biog film, we had to sort of give them enough of a tease, like, holy shit, something's really amazing about this guy. I want to know more. Let's keep watching. And then after the credits, you go back to the 1950s when he's born in Melbourne, and then start the story there. So it was pretty craftily put together. Yeah.
And it was interesting to see his relationship with his mother, who was not terribly accepting of him early on, but seems to have perhaps become more accepting, as we see later in the documentary. Yeah,
I mean, with old age comes wisdom a little bit, and she's 94 now. So I think she was the first person I interviewed, actually. Peter was coming to Australia to see his mum and sister. So I met up with them in Cairns and was able to I just wanted to get an understanding of who Peter was and what his childhood was, so that I could understand why it is that he became this activist later in life. And it was there that I hit on the idea of this, because I could see how religious his mum was. And then I started to understand that Peter's had this very strict religious upbringing, and it's that moral backbone that is his moral compass today, I believe. And so, then I started looking at mythology and stuff like that, and there's this Jesus Christ-like aspect to Peter's work in terms of, what Jesus was doing back in the day was looking out for the poor people and trying to inspire them, and Peter does something similar in a modern context. Yeah, but the mum was amazing. Sorry, I lost the question though.
No,
family a bit here.
Yeah, just how accepting she seemed to be at the end. Yeah,
she's not that accepting.
No,
I mean, no. I think it's one of those things where it's not like she loves her son, and even though she believes in something else, she accepts that that's the path that he's taken. And I mean, she says it in the film, if you're happy, I'm happy. But ultimately, I don't think she'd feel that comfortable in, for instance, Peter having a gay marriage at her church. I don't think she would be someone that would be attending that ceremony. So she is quite strict in terms of what she believes is the right thing, and it is at conflict with Peter's ideals, unfortunately.
Sure. Peter's approach to things is really interesting. He's obviously very strongly human rights focused, gay rights, etc., and will pick up issues and run with them, and is not afraid to be involved in physical confrontations. I suppose one of the issues is how were there any issues or anything that he has been involved with that you were uncomfortable about putting into the documentary?
No, there's nothing I was uncomfortable about. Even like the stuff with the archbishops, I was raised as a candlestick boy in a church when I was a kid. The local priest was over the road, and his son and I were friends, so I'd go off to church every Sunday morning. And I just remember the hypocrisy of it all, I love the theatrics of it. But then once I started realizing, that gay people exist in the world, and there's a stigma about them, which is primarily led because of religious persecution of gay people, it's always unnerved me. So when Peter takes on these people and tyrants and things, I'm rallying for him. I mean, in the film, I've contextualized it in a way that might look as though I might be on the fence about some of that activism, but I'm pretty much wholeheartedly supporting Peter's style of radical politics there. But for the narrative, it needed to sort of show Peter sort of losing the battle, so to speak, and being a little bit out on his own. And he was. And at the time, and that's what really drew me to Peter's story, was just how here he is fighting for gay rights, and here's all these gay people doing nothing, criticizing him. And I just couldn't understand that when I first met Peter and got to London. And I just couldn't believe that there was so many people that were very anti-Peter Tatchell, and particularly in the gay community. So, you know, I had to explore that in the film. Yeah, it was a big theme. Yeah.
Sure. And in fact, he even ran politically, tried to get elected, that sort of thing. And that was met with a lot of resistance, as it turns out. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you see it even in recent politics with Jeremy Corbyn's campaign to become the Prime Minister of Great Britain recently. And the way the media just turned on Corbyn and, you know, was able to use its influence to sort of change minds and hearts, particularly Labor supporters, against Corbyn. And, you know, it was like what Peter describes in the film as this dripping effect that over a sustained campaign against him over a long period. And then eventually people just go, well, if they're still talking about it, there must be some sort of, you know, this must be real. So then they go against Corbyn. And you see it in Brazil politics as well, and American politics. And, you know, it happened to Peter 40 years ago. Yeah, sadly. So I think it was nice to have that in the film, and hopefully people will watch that and they'll draw their own conclusions about what's happening in a contemporary political landscape based on what they see here, and it might resonate with them, hopefully. Yeah.
Yes, definitely. How's Peter's health? Because obviously with the injuries he's sustained and so on, it appears there's a brain injury or there's some impact on him. How is he coping with that?
Yeah, it's really hard for him. And whenever I do catch up with him, it always feels like really critical. I think COVID has sort of clipped his wings a little bit, so he's been able to get a lot of rest over the last year and a half. But now Britain's all opened up again. He's out there doing, like, going to events and things. And he was saying to me that a lot of people aren't wearing masks in the UK, and they're coming up and wanting to shake his hand and get really close to him. And he's very nervous about allowing people too close to him. So he does take his health really serious because he wants to live to, you know, he thinks he'll be campaigning till the day he dies, sort of thing. So, and he reckons he's got it like maybe 2 or 3 more decades in him still. So I don't know, despite his health, he soldiers on, but I know he struggles a lot with typing, and memory recall's not as good as it used to be. So when he's doing like broadcasting interviews and things, he sometimes may have to do a few takes now. He always gets it right when he's live though, but if he's doing sort of radio interviews or something that's pre-recorded, he'll usually do a few takes of a soundbite, so to speak. Whereas 20 years ago, he'd be able to just nail it straight away. So yeah, and I think it frustrates him and does get him a bit upset sometimes. But yeah, that's just from what I can see of Peter. Yeah.
No, I understand. It's so interesting, and the final title in the documentary reveals over 70 countries where being gay is illegal or leads to sorts of issues. That is incredible.
Yeah, what's really awful about that as well is a lot of those British ex-colonial type countries in Africa, and you know, the British Empire put a lot of these homophobic laws into these countries where they didn't have any laws about gay rights. And so it's awful that they've still, this old historical legislation in these countries is still exists. And it's awful too, because, you know, in the Commonwealth Summit, they don't even bring this up as a topic to discuss amongst all the Commonwealth countries. So, you know, there's so far to go still in terms of the world sort of uniting behind the LGBT liberation movement. There's still a lot of suicides, a lot of miseducation, and things like HIV are rampant in these countries where LGBT is still illegal. So, there's so much work to still do, particularly in the Middle East as well. So even though like here in Australia and also in the UK and America, we feel like the battle's won, it's really not won at all. No.
Incredible. Well, your documentary, I'm sure, will assist perhaps in that process and getting the word out there. So it was great that you're able to secure a deal with Netflix. It's great that the film is available.
Yeah, Netflix. So that's for 3 years, I think, and it's great because it's a platform that's all around the world, and it has subtitles in multiple languages, so it's easily accessible. Just got to get those eyeballs and get the word of mouth out there to spread the word that it's on there, because sometimes with Netflix, it's such a vast catalogue library of exciting documentaries and films and TV shows that it's easy to get lost amongst all of that. Hopefully the algorithms sort of are pointing it in the right direction of the people that might like to see this film. Yeah.
Well, part of the success of your documentary is that the Melbourne International Film Festival partly funded it, and that's where I first saw it. So it's getting that sort of support, which I think is very important for a film like this.
Yeah, and the film festival has been a bit hard for us because Netflix went live globally back in May. There was a holdback here in Australia. So a lot of the way film festivals, their guidelines, they're still sort of pre-COVID, where they want first screenings and premieres and things. But with the way the world is now COVID, I think they're going to have to start pivoting a little bit differently and sort of allowing stuff that's already, because, there's a lot of people that don't have Netflix. We've got a screening happening next month at Raindance Film Festival in London as well, which is going to be a big red carpet affair. And that'll be the first time Peter's seen the film in a cinema. And, we made it for cinema. So it's a little bit, it's a little bit bittersweet that it's on Netflix, but at the same time, we're made for cinema and we haven't been able to get lots of cinema screenings up and running. Because of the whole COVID thing. But, it's a mixed blessing because a lot of people are at home watching Netflix as well. So in terms of eyeballs, I think we're probably winning.
I'm sure it will attract an audience. Chris, what attracted you to filmmaking in the first place?
I've always loved movies. I always liked stories, and I used to read a lot when I was a child. But the cinema, I grew up in Rockhampton, we only had one cinema. So pretty much every new release I would go and watch, and because it's just the one cinema, you got sort of the top tier academy type films coming to Rockhampton. So I'd see a lot of like Kramer versus Kramer and, early Robert De Niro and Godfather and things like that. Stuff I shouldn't have probably been seeing. But, they'd let you in sort of thing. And I just loved movies and storytelling, and particularly Australian cinema I was really fond of. There was a lot of cinema in the 80s out of Australia, and it was just seeing those stories on a big screen and the music and, it's escapism as well. So maybe I had a little bit of a troubling childhood, so I guess the cinema was my escape as well. So, yeah. I'm going to move into fiction, scripted drama next as well.
I was going to ask you what you're heading towards. So,
Yeah. No, I'm working on another documentary about something happening here in Queensland. But at the same time, I'm also writing screenplays as well. Yeah.
Okay, great. Just harking back to Hating Peter Tatchell, the music score I found really interesting. You have two composers there who were involved. It's interesting the way you've integrated the music into the documentary.
Yeah, I always knew I wanted a score. Bob and Barn, I met at Cannes Film Festival at a market there, and I knew that the score would be a way of bringing together lots of found footage and different archives shot on different cameras and different quality as a way of sort of bridging a band-aid over the whole story that made it cohesive. So when it got down to the fine cut of the film, I reached out to them. They've been coming back to me constantly, circling back about the film. And what was really amazing is the whole score was done in post-COVID lockdown. So Bob and Barn composed, they sent me sort of versions of songs, and then we hit on a couple of songs that I really liked, music. And then we scored the whole thing using some of their stuff that they've already got, plus new stuff. But eventually, I think it's about 40 minutes of original music was written, and all of the musicians, the music was written, then turned into notes, was sent out to all these different homes around the world with different instruments. They recorded their bit and then sent it all back in. Then it was mixed. So normally you'd put the film up in a theater, and you'd have the orchestra there and the conductor, and they would workshop it. But this was done completely different. It was all done remotely. It was amazing. And the score was just, it sort of has a little bit of that sort of Russian vibe about it, that militant sort of vibe, but it's also got lots of soft levels as well. Yeah, I think it's brilliant. We're going to release the soundtrack actually on Spotify soon. So yeah, I'll let you know. Yeah.
Yeah, well done on that. So tell me, Chris, are there any particular films or filmmakers that may have inspired your approach to hating Peter Tatchell?
For this film, no, but I've always liked Oliver Stone films. I think he's someone that I find is someone that works in that sort of radical activist space in Hollywood. So probably him. But in terms of like a reference for this film, I watched a lot of activist biography films, like I Am Not Your Negro and Maya D'Angelo and D'Angela Davis and Black Panther documentaries and things like that. And there was a style there, but I think I've sort of wanted my own sort of style, if you know what I mean? And I didn't want to limit myself in trying to replicate something that was already out there in the marketplace. And what's a little bit unusual with this film is that it actually goes through different styles. So stylistically, you're usually, for a biography film, you do it very much archive-based, but with Peter, he's still alive and active today. So there was also, I was able to sort of go observational doc there at the end. So for the last sort of 15 minutes of the film, you're sort of with him through his point of view. And that, I think, makes it a different sort of documentary to what people are usually seeing. And I think that's why people are responding so positively to this story. But yeah, I don't know, like in terms of other documentaries, I quite like that film, The Big Short, and the way that had lots of tentacles to the story about the banking crisis, the housing crisis. I guess that was a little bit of a reference point, but no, not specifically. Yeah.
Okay, no, that's fine. That's fine. That's a good range of possible influences. And have you seen anything lately that has impressed you?
What, in documentary?
Anything?
Or
Film,
look,
TV, whatever.
Piece of entertainment this year that's really blown my mind was The Mayor of Easttown, the Kate Winslet TV series. I thought that was brilliant. It was a crime drama, but it was done in such a subtle way that sort of drew you in, and then it just had lots of twists and turns. So I really enjoyed that. At the cinema, I do keep a little list, but yeah, I don't know off the top of my head. I watch so many movies.
That's all right.
Are you looking for some movie tips?
Well, if you have seen something like, well, Mayor of Easttown is a good example. That's,
look,
yeah.
I've got a little list. I keep a top 10 list going. And at the end of the year, I compile a top 10 list. But this year, I really loved A Promising Young Woman. I thought that was exceptional. And The Father was brilliant with Anthony Hopkins. I love that as well. And in terms of Australian films, I really like this one called Higher Ground. I don't know if you saw that.
Yep.
And The Dig was quite good. Coda's a really good film that did really well at Sundance this year. That's on Apple. Yeah, and in terms of documentary, last year I really liked My Octopus Teacher on Netflix. I thought that was really great. And I really liked Invisible Man as well last year as well. Yeah, so there's a few. Oh, the Bee Gees documentary is really good if you haven't seen that. Yeah.
Well, that's a good eclectic range of different films and TV series and whatever. Chris, congratulations on Hating Peter Tatchell. People can see it now on Netflix. And we've been speaking to Chris Amos, the writer-director of Hating Peter Tatchell. Chris, thanks so much for talking with me.
Okay, thank you for having me.
No worries at all. Thanks again.
Bye-bye.